What you are about to hear was not an isolated excess. It was permitted, it was organized, and it was legal in Rome. Captured women were not just prisoners, they were part of the spectacle. And when one of these practices surfaced, even the Roman Senate was forced to intervene. This is the story of the system that turned people into public property. Under Rome's loudest arena, a 19-year-old woman sat in complete dark. The roar above her was physical enough to rattle the iron links at her wrists, the sand of the arena a distant, thunderous sea. Her name was Sabina. She had been brought from the hills of Deon after her people were crushed, marched beneath triumphal arches, and then below the Colosseum into a world designed not for sanctuary, but for control. She had watched her brothers fall to a man whose fame came from killing. Now that same fame made him eligible to select spoils from the conquered. What happened after the crowd left would force Rome's lawmakers to answer a question they had preferred to avoid. How far could spectacle reach into human dignity before even the Senate felt compelled to act? If you want more deep dives like this, like and subscribe. The Colosseum was a machine built to show power in its most theatrical form. Its outer rings rose in stone and concrete, but the real engineering, its raw intent, lay beneath the sand. The hypogeum, a network of rooms, shafts, and pulleys, made spectacle predictable and repeatable. Cages and waiting cells accommodated animals and prisoners. Lifts, operated by teams of slaves and complex gearing, could hurl a roaring beast or a swinging set piece into the sunlight in moments. The structure gave administrators control over time and image, who would appear when, how they would be presented, and how the crowd would be fed violence and triumph as if on demand. Within this system, ritual and bureaucracy intertwined. The rewards granted to victors were not simply coins or palm branches. They were privileges codified in custom and sometimes in law. A victorious gladiator or a commander returning from campaign could claim various spoils, land, money, even people. In arenas, this meant that captive women might be paraded as part of the entertainment, or in some cases, offered to those whose skill or luck had won the day. A bronze tablet or tally might record the choices. An official master of the games and attendants would process captives, mark them, and consign them into categories: property, entertainment, medical quarantine. What the public saw on the sand, stripped down to gesture and sound, was only the surface of an administrative apparatus below the floorboards. This is not a reconstruction from imagination alone. Archaeological evidence and scattered documentary traces suggest a system of processing captives beneath the amphitheater. Chains, compartments built to hold persons out of sight, and tags stamped to indicate status.
Ancient chroniclers sometimes skirt the topic. Cassius Dio and Tacitus mention spectacles and spoil-taking in broad strokes, but show a remarkable reticence when it came to the mechanics of how people were parceled out after battle. There are references and indications, but behind the rhetorical flourishes of triumph and moralizing, the details are often left to implication. Modern excavations have filled some of those gaps, but even then historians debate how routine or exceptional certain practices were. Where the documentary record is thin, archaeological finds give concrete weight to reconstructions and also limit them. The day the captured Deon women were brought to Rome, they were paraded into the arena as part of triumphal pageantry tied to Marcus Antonius's campaign. The amphitheater filled. 60,000 or more watched as the women, shackled at the wrists and ankles, were lifted up from the hypogeum. Some of them were presented for spectacle, placed in mock combat with wooden swords, a humiliating mimicry of fighting that the audience could treat as theater rather than a life-and-death contest. The ritual served a double purpose. It dramatized Rome's mastery, and it rehearsed the social script of domination. For spectators, it was entertainment. For the prisoners, it was a formalized stripping of agency. Smell mingled with shouts, sweat, sand, oil from lamps, while the women, dressed in the simplest garments, were forced to perform a choreography that made their defeat a public ritual. Sabina and a woman identified in the reports as Compel refused to play the role assigned to them. Where a woman of the arena was expected to comply, Sabina stepped forward and would not lift a wooden blade. Compel did the same. The crowd, conditioned to expect conflict and spectacle, first grew impatient and then angry. The masters of the games ordered the guards to enforce compliance. The guards were the hinge between theater and coercion. Small men in leather and iron who could drag, strike, or bind. They obeyed procedure. The women, standing in the glare and scent of oil and blood, became not just participants in a show, but objects under inventory. The show ended, but the system only proceeded to its next stage. Once removed from the sand, captives were not left to fate but processed.
Contemporary terms for the procedure are few and ambiguous, so the reconstruction that follows is drawn from both the textual hints of ancient authors and the concrete traces unearthed in modern digs. In the hypogeum there were chambers, small rooms with stone benches, iron rings embedded in the floors, channels to facilitate washing or drainage, and narrow passages through which attendants could move. Bronze tags, some stamped with the word captiva, appear in these contexts. The tags can be read as a kind of ledger, a portable form of paperwork.
One could imagine a line of captives waiting, a clerk consulting a roll or a tablet, and a bronze disc clipped to a chain or garment that marked status and recorded disposition. This is the setting into which Gaius Valerius Maximus, a celebrated gladiator whose name had just climbed into the city's gossip, stepped. Gaius was not a senator. He was a man whose social power grew out of the arena. His victories were public capital, transferable into favors. Tradition entitled a victor to certain rewards, and in this theater of spoils, the expectation of taking a captive as a prize was implicit in the ritual, even if the specifics varied by occasion. What happened in Sabina's small hypogeum cell is harder to reconstruct with documentary certainty than the public spectacle above, but enough sources and later accounts leave us with a plausible, anguish-filled picture. Gaius entered Sabina's chamber not as a courtly rescuer, but as a man expecting recompense in a culture that routinely converted human beings into property. He expected to claim her, and the record suggests that he chose instead a course that surprised his peers. The conversation between Sabina and Gaius cannot be paraphrased as a transcript. The sources do not afford that luxury. What historians can say, cautiously and with acknowledgement of limits, is that Gaius recognized something in Sabina that made the procedural pick, one more formality in a chain of distribution, feel untenable to him. In a decision that has been variously described as merciful, cowardly, or scandalous, depending on the teller, Gaius declared Sabina ill and ordered her moved to the medical holding area rather than to public distribution. He called for the rudis or the clerk to affix a bronze tag marking her status as requiring medical quarantine. By invoking a procedural label, illness, Gaius exploited the bureaucracy it had helped create. He used its forms to extract Sabina from the immediate break of public allocation. This act was a procedural subversion more than a moral manifesto. Labeling someone ill did not guarantee protection. The medical area beneath the Colosseum was not a sanctuary. It was an isolated compartment where the sick received rudimentary attention and where infectious wounds could be cleaned or left to fester. Moving Sabina there removed her from the arena's direct pipeline of humiliation and redistribution, but it also put her into a marginal institutional category where care was pragmatic, not pediatric. The record indicates that she survived only a few days before dying of infection, an outcome that illustrates how small acts of compassion could be both meaningful and tragically insufficient. Gaius's refusal to accept the reward did not pass unnoticed. In the gladiators' barracks, where status and reputation were currency, his decision raised eyebrows and ire.
Trainers prized the predictability of rewards because they were levers of discipline and motivation. Gladiators who had fought and bled expected to translate their victories into tangible benefits. A refusal suggested a moral failing to some and a mutiny of sorts to others. Rumors spread through the corridors. Some praised the spirit of the man who spared a life. Others accused him of cowardice or of undermining the system that made them what they were. The trainers complained. Fellow fighters muttered about missed perks. The episode fed a gossip network and then moved beyond it. Beyond gossip, the matter reached the Senate. That transition from arena rumor to formal complaint was neither automatic nor inevitable. It required a voice willing to name the problem in public. Senator Quintus Aurelius Semachus took that step. He stood in the Curia and lodged a complaint that was as much a moral outrage as a political maneuver. A gladiator's choice had pierced the polished surface of Roman spectacle and exposed the practice of turning captives into public property. Semachus framed his complaint not simply as a defense of dignity, but as a matter of civic order. If the spectacle's rules could be upended by private whims, then the political language of control and the social calm that flowed from it were at risk. The Senate's reaction was not monolithic. Senator Fabius, representing a conservative voice, urged caution. He argued that spectacle and spoils had long been instruments of Roman power, and that narrow reforms could leave the state weaker in the eyes of its enemies. Reformist senators, by contrast, saw the public scandal as an opportunity to draw a line between acceptable spectacle and public humiliation. The debate, as reported in contemporary records and later histories, was heated and revealing. Some members worried less about the suffering of captives than about the optics of impropriety. A gladiator refusing a reward looked like a challenge to the established order. From this debate emerged what contemporaries and later chroniclers called the lex captivity. Issued, according to the record, on October 1, 79 AD, the law prohibited the public distribution and spectacle-based humiliation of captive women. It did not free captives from being property. It limited one form of public use. The legislation instead shifted the practice out of the amphitheater's direct glare and into more regulated channels: private allocation, sale, or internal processing. The lex captivity was not a dramatic moral turn, but a political compromise. It sanitized the spectacle while preserving the underlying structures of domination. It acknowledged that the public ritual had become politically costly, if not morally indefensible in the eyes of some elites, and it preferred to remove the most visible expression of the problem, rather than to address the fundamentals of the institution. It is important to mark the caveats historians insist upon.
The lex did not abolish the conversion of people into spoils. It limited public humiliation, but left intact the legal frameworks that allowed captive acquisition, sale, and domestic exploitation. Moreover, the surviving mentions of the law come through later or fractured reports. Scholars debate its scope, enforcement, and true language. Some argue that what passed in Rome was a narrow regulation targeted at amphitheater spectacle, while others see it as a signal of shifting public sensibilities. The legislative response, then, is less a clean moral victory than an institutional attempt to manage reputation. While written records sketch the politics of the moment, archaeological evidence supplies a hard, material backbone to the story's darker details. In 2018, excavations beneath the Colosseum, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato from the University of Rome, uncovered structural elements consistent with the kind of hypogeum processing described in reconstructions. The dig revealed small chambers with iron anchor rings set into the stone, channels that could function for drainage, and narrow partitions that suggested temporary confinement. Perhaps most striking were bronze tags, small discs stamped with the word captiva, found in contexts associated with these rooms. The tags are not proof of routine abuse. They are, however, tangible proof that the administrators below the arena used markers to record the presence and status of captives. Archaeologists are cautious about collapsing artifact into a single narrative. The presence of rings and tags shows infrastructure designed to contain and to categorize. It does not, by itself, prove the frequency or the precise mechanics of humiliation in the ways popular narratives sometimes claim. Yet taken together with the textual hints, discrete references by ancient chroniclers, and legal reactions, these finds give force to the claim that the amphitheater was more than a place of public spectacle. It was an institution that routed bodies through bureaucratic stages. The hypogeum was architecture made to control human beings, to make them visible or invisible as suits the show. Historiography complicates everything further. The sources that survive, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, and certain rhetorical or moralistic writers, mention spectacle and practice in varying degrees of candor. Tacitus, for instance, is eloquent in moral judgment, but often elliptical on procedural detail. Cassius Dio is comprehensive and political, but sometimes selective in what he records. An author cited in some later references appears as Seneca or a similarly spelled variant. The name is obscure in our manuscript traditions and appears unclearly in some records, which has caused confusion among editors. This inconsistency in the sources is not accidental. Ancient writers had their own agendas. They wrote for readers who wanted moral drama, rhetorical flourish, and political lessons, not an anthropological manual of the hypogeum.
Because of these gaps in fragmentary accounts, modern historians debate how routine the practice of distributing captive women as spectacle actually was. Some argue that occasional acts, akin to what happened to Sabina, were not the norm, but were spectacular enough to attract comment. Others suggest the amphitheater's operations and the presence of administrative markers imply that the system was regular, even if the scale remains contested. Archaeology amplifies the argument by showing the built environment that would allow systematic processing. Literary reticence suggests a civic discomfort with stating the practice plainly. Taken together, the evidence forms a pattern that is both alarming and ambiguous. The story's human core, Sabina's short, terraced life beneath the arena, shows the limits of legal reform and individual mercy. Gass's action complicates a simple narrative of evil and resistance. He bent the system to his will in order to spare a person from immediate spectacle, yet his act could not dismantle the apparatus that produced the suffering. Sabina's death in the medical holding area a few days later is a reminder that small acts of compassion, though meaningful, may be inadequate in a system designed for exploitation. This is where the moral question widens beyond individuals. Rome's power lay in its ability to turn human affairs into procedures, forms, tags, chambers, and legal verdicts. Such bureaucratic devices make cruelty administrable and often, therefore, invisible. Systems routinize violence until it is unremarked, until a gladiator refuses, until a senator complains, and then the public feels the jolt of recognition. Something structural has been normalized. The lex captivity responded to the shock of public exposure, not to the ethics at captivity itself. That gap between reform and root cause defines much of the tragedy. There is also a lesson about memory and erasure. Sabina's name survives where most did not because her refusal intersected with a man whose fame mattered and with senators who could translate scandal into legislation. Millions of unnamed victims remain in the fog of antiquity, present in stone and stain but absent in the speeches that elite men left behind. Archaeology can partially recover them, bronze tags, bones, traces of chains, but material traces cannot restore individual lives. They can, however, force modern readers to confront the mechanics by which a civilization famed for engineering and law could also institutionalize humiliation. The episode forces a broader reflection. Technical sophistication does not equal moral progress. A society that builds arches, aqueducts, and amphitheaters can simultaneously design systems that objectify and commodify people. Architecture and paperwork, things we often read as achievements, can be repurposed to enforce degradation. The same ingenuity that raised faults can also raise mechanisms of control.
Recognizing that duality is not an exercise in cynicism, but a necessary honesty about human institutions. When we look back, we must hold two truths together. First, Rome's amphitheater was a place of grandeur and human horror, where powerful rituals of dominance were played before vast crowds. Second, the reaction to Sabina's case shows that even within a system that normalized cruelty, there were limits, social, political, and legal, that could be leveraged to reduce certain kinds of public spectacle. The lex captivity was not abolition, it was a recalibration. It took away the most visible form of humiliation, while preserving the larger framework of domination. Archaeology and historiography together show why the Senate felt shocked enough to act. The bronze tags stamped Captiva and the hypogeum chambers recovered in the 2018 dig make concrete the claim that administrators engineered the processing of people as part of entertainment. Literary sources, Cassius Dio's political narratives, Tacitus's moralizing histories, and the ambiguous reference to a writer named Seneca in some texts reveal a rhetorical landscape that avoided blunt testimony about these procedures. The gap between material evidence and rhetorical silence explains why a single dramatic incident could produce a law. The system had been working quietly enough that few had focused on its mechanics until someone with standing forced the issue into the light. What should we take away from a story like Sabina's? Perhaps first, the modest but urgent lesson that we must name systems where they exist. When cruelty becomes procedural, codified in tags, rooms, and legal forms, we cannot assume reform will follow from visibility alone. Gas's refusal mattered precisely because it exposed procedure. Semachus's complaint mattered because a senator translated exposure into policy. These were important steps, yet the deeper structures endured. If memory has a duty, it is to recall the names of those who were processed and to recognize how easy it is for functional brilliance to coexist with moral blindness. In the end, the Senate's unease was not purely sentimental. It reflected a recognition that spectacle which reduces people to spoil erodes the civic language of respect that sustained Rome's political order. The lex captivity responded to that unease by closing one door to public humiliation. It did not open the jail cell of historical conscience. Remembering Sabina, Camacicus, and the bureaucratic apparatus beneath the sand is a way of insisting that technical achievement cannot be the sole criterion by which we judge a civilization. If this unsettled you, tell us which details struck you most in the comments, and subscribe for more history uncovered.